Hello, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. I'm making a vlog here that I wanted to make for quite some time, and it's about how martial arts is not self-defense. Martial arts is not self-defense. Now, I'm making this vlog and posting it on my Provocative Hypnosis vlog, partially because as a former self-defense instructor and as a almost lifelong martial artist, I'm kind of tired of seeing seminar instructors, hypnotherapists, NLP coaches, psychotherapists use martial arts analogies in their books and their seminars and present it as functional self-defense. Now, doing that borders on the unethical, because what you're essentially doing, if you're presenting traditional martial arts as self-defense, is that you're essentially giving people a first aid toolkit that doesn't really work. Now, these are harsh words, but I stand by it. So here's the distinction. For between 1996 and 2012, I was a professional self-defense instructor in addition to doing the change work that I've done for the last 20 years. And what we would often do is create real-time self-defense simulations. So we would create a context. We would create roles where, for example, one guy is the mugger, or two guys are the muggers, and they have a rubber knife, for example, and they're attempting to mug person C. And person C's job might be to attempt to verbally defuse it, to stun and run, to somehow get out of there. So we would create these realistic scenarios, and we would use protective gear, plexiglass helmets, body suits, equipment that allowed you to absorb punishment and feel the pain without getting hurt. So that's an important part. So not choreography, not sparring, but actual self-defense simulations with dialogue, with fear, with adrenaline, with a lot of contact and full speed. Now, the really interesting thing is that when I did this, I would get people from other schools, various martial arts schools, who would come by and do these self-defense simulations. And the interesting part is very often you could not see the difference between the trained martial artist and the raw beginner. Sometimes the raw beginner actually did better at these simulations. And I saw time and time and time again experienced martial artists, black belts, whose older skills went straight out the window. They reverted back to sloppy haymakers and shitty tackles and the type of tactics that you would expect from the untrained person. Sometimes they fared even worse. Why? Because there's often a conflict between what your body wants to do instinctively to protect itself and what various martial arts theoretically teach people that they should do. So, for example, if somebody chokes you and really chokes you with rage and with the intent to really hurt you, you're not going to knee someone in the groin or attempt some sort of wrist lock. Your hands are instinctively gonna come up to protect your breathing apparatus. So if you learn a traditional martial arts technique that's based upon anything else than that, what you're essentially doing is that you're creating a conflict between what the body wants to actually do without having trained and a theoretical construct. which then very often gets in the way. Because if your body wants to do this to defend against the choke, and you have trained yourself theoretically to swing your arm over and attempt to bring the person into some sort of arm lock or something else, then you're creating a conflict. And you're actually worse off from the person who just does this and then might do something back. So one thing I discovered by doing these self-defense simulations, which I picked up from a guy named Tony Blauer in Canada, who I trained with for a little while, just to give credit where credit is due, is that it's of course fake. You know, any type of simulation that you do is per definition fake, but it's the most real fake thing that you can do. And the paradox is that even if people intellectually know that it's a fake, remember the client I told you about in the last vlog, titled Trauma, Change, and Self-Defense Training, who was kind of laughing a bit before we did this because intellectually she knew that it was fake and not real. But once it happened, she responded as if it was completely real. She responded in exactly the same way that she did when she froze during the attempted rape that she was here to deal with the aftermath of. So if you want your skills to be there for you realistically in the real world, you have to practice in a psychophysiological state, at least some of the time, that's similar enough. Because what very often happens with traditional martial arts training is that they practice defending against choreography, defending against agreed upon attacks where the other person's cooperating and there's no fear, there's no adrenaline. And they're doing this in a state of relative calm. And the moves are very often based upon fine motor skills. Now, you might get really good at that in the choreographed atmosphere of the dojo or training hall. But if you end up in a real encounter, a mugging, an attempted rape, someone tries to kill you, or some psychopath just tries to strangle the living crap out of you, you're likely going to be in a very different state of mind. You're going to have an adrenaline rush. You know, you're going to have tunnel vision. You might be hyperventilating. You might have adrenaline shakes. You might freeze for a little while. Your fine motor skills that, you know, are essential for wrist locks and many of these fancy traditional martial arts moves are out the window. And the other person's pain tolerance is also going to be a lot higher because that person's going to have some adrenaline as well. So if the gap between the state that you've practiced in and the state that you're actually in when you're in a real encounter, if that gap is too wide, there might not necessarily be a bridge. There might not necessarily be a bridge between the skills that you practiced in the calm, cooperative atmosphere and the holy shit, the shit hits the fan atmosphere that you're likely to be in a real encounter. So this is one reason why martial arts training, the way it's done, is not self-defense. You're not creating scenarios that are as close as you can get to the real thing. So again, as I mentioned, you know, even if people know that it's fake, I've seen many black belts, people with a lot of experience in martial arts, completely lose access to older skills in these sorts of simulations. So just to categorize this a little bit, for the sake of accuracy, I like to use three categories. So on the one hand, you have traditional martial arts. Might be something like Aikido or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu or most of the martial arts, where you're practicing a art form, and you're practicing for the most part choreography, defending against someone who attacks you with techniques from your particular style, and the other person's cooperating and not really trying to hurt you in the respectful, disciplined atmosphere of the training hole. You're learning an art. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is something ethically wrong with promoting that as real life self-defense. It's not adequate. And this is partially why I post this on NLP and hypnosis forums. I'm tired of seeing people like Richard Bandler, John Grinder, Stephen Gilligan. I'm naming names, but screw it. Who talk about self-defense in seminars, and they present Aikido moves. Now, if you're doing that, you're not reality testing well. You've either never been in a fight, or you don't have the reality testing skills to see the difference between bullshit and what actually works. There's so many intellectuals, for example, who practice an art such as Aikido, and they love the philosophy. The philosophy of nonviolence. It sounds so appealing, but it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And the training doesn't work to prepare someone for a real encounter. So if somebody sells that, they're not reality testing well. Now, second category is martial arts sports or contact ring sports. So we're talking kickboxing, Muay Thai, mixed martial arts, judo, wrestling, this type of stuff. Now, this is more realistic. It helps you develop a lot of attributes: speed, power, endurance, the ability to take a shot, techniques that actually work against a resisting opponent. So this is valuable. I've been practicing both traditional arts and full contact sports for most of my life. So this is relevant. It's highly relevant, but it's still not specifically self-defense training. Why? Well, because, for example, currently I'm doing Muay Thai or Thai boxing. It's a really rough martial art, but you're practicing it through sparring. You're sparring someone who's attempting to nail you with knees and low kicks and boxing moves back. This is a high intensity sparring. It's really good, but it's strictly not martial arts per se, or self-defense per se, even if the training is useful. So what qualifies as self-defense training then? Well, here's what I think you have to be able to realistically call something self-defense training and to have good ethics on your side. You need to spend at least some of the time studying predator-prey interactions, the criminology, the psychology of violence, street smarts, how to avoid situations, how victims get selected, that type of stuff. It's hugely relevant. You need to work on your verbal diffusing skills, meaning how can you, because most encounters won't start with shaking gloves and then sparring. They'll very often start with some verbal altercation. There is very often some sort of conversation or dialogue or screening before the actual attack. So how can you verbally diffuse a situation? How can you use your body language, using nonviolent postures, for example, to calm someone down? So one way I know if someone's really practicing self-defense is if I'm seeing people practicing doing actual nonviolent postures. This is an example of a nonviolent postures where I can verbally diffuse, I can speak to the person, and I can also set the other person up for a sucker punch or for an attack from here or from here or from here. So if someone's spending older time practicing bobbing and weaving and moving from a guard position, that's sport fighting. In a real encounter, you're more likely to be here, for example, talking before someone attempts to sucker punch you or comes at you with some sort of rage attack. So you have to practice from there. Do you actually practice defending a sucker punch? And do you practice setting another person up for a sucker punch? For example, asking the person a question, positioning yourself, and then while the person's thinking of the question, you nail the person with a shot. You know, a good street thug, if you will, in the same way that a boxer might use his left jab to set up his left hook and his right cross, is going to use verbal distraction, verbal techniques to set you up for a blitz attack or a sucker punch. So you might get knocked out before you even realize that you're actually in an altercation. So you need to practice that type of stuff. Do you practice actual simulations where you might have 2-on-1 scenarios or a weapon scenario, or you might be sitting in a chair or being in a stairway? We sometimes used to do simulations out in the snow, with winter coats and scarves, on the sand volleyball place, on slippery wet grass, in staircases. This stuff also completely changes it, with street clothes sometimes under the protective gear. This is super important. And it's also important because a really big difference between a sport fight and a real encounter is consent. Even if you do no holds barred fighting or mixed martial arts, which is tough as hell, you've still consented to fight. You know that you're going to fight. You've signed the contract. So being in a state of certainty, having consented to fight, is very different from being ambushed, from being surprised, for example, or even from being in a state of uncertainty, meaning I'm not sure whether I'm actually going to fight. So I'll give you an example. If you took a boxer and you put him in the ring and you started throwing jabs and crosses and hook punches, that person would use their footwork, they would parry, they would slip with their head, stuff like that. If you had asked them, what's the time, and then lunged to sucker punched, they'd do this. They'd shield themselves. They'd cover up like this. They would react in the exact same way as everyone else for a second or two. The flinch response would come in. So your body is going to respond completely different. So you want to, at least some of the time, try to create the conditions where people might respond as if completely surprised, or at least not knowing when they're going to be attacked, because your responses are different. This is also a big advantage with systems such as Tony Blauer's spear system, Krav Maga, these Senshido, these practical arts where people are converting flinches. So, for example, pushing away danger, covering, shielding like this. These are things that the body instinctively wants to do without having trained, and you're likely to do that if someone suddenly attacks you. So being able to convert those flinches into something offensive, something protective, gives you a bridge to your system when the shit hits the fan. So that's also something that you want to look at. And finally, for something to be real self-defense, if you're trained and you're attacked and you end up hurting your attacker, your toughest opponent is likely going to be the legal system, at least here in Norway. If you get attacked and your attacker gets hurt, you risk being sent to jail. We don't really have neither the culture nor the laws that really honors an individual's right to self-defense. We're more this collectivist society that doesn't really honor that. So you risk being put away. So how do you deal with the police interrogation? afterwards, for example? How do you deal with lawyers? How do you deal with the actual court system? The aftermath of the whole thing. So for real self-defense, if that's what you want to do, how do you avoid situations? How do you verbally diffuse them? How do you create scenarios that are as realistic as the real thing as you can get, knowing that you can never actually get there, but you want to do it as realistically as you can? And how do you deal with the aftermath of it? If you're not really covering those things, you're not really practicing self-defense. And this is an invitation for people who teach hypnosis and NLP and psychology and so on and so forth to kind of check their martial arts metaphors and to at least make a distinction in honoring that martial arts and self-defense is not the same. Now I'll say this, having been a professional self-defense instructor, having worked as a doorman, having had to use my skills for real, I deeply appreciate the self-defense aspect. I also love competitive martial arts. I've competed, and traditional martial arts. I've competed in everything from board breaking to traditional and musical forms, to judo, to point fighting, to full contact kickboxing, to no holds barred fighting. So I love that stuff. I deeply appreciate it. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying that we really need to honor the distinctions and be as realistic about it as possible. If you're looking for some information about how self-defense training might be very relevant in cases of trauma and change work, feel free to consult the vlog piece that I did before this one, titled Trauma, Change Work, and Self-Defense. So, till next time, have a good one.